In this video, I want to show you how to replace your knock sensor. This will involve removing the whole air intake assembly, which is underneath these covers and the rest of the air intake. So let's get started. To disconnect the battery, use an 8mm wrench and remove the negative terminal. Now, you don't have to remove the wheel. I did only for camera purposes, but if you come through the passenger side wheel well, you can see the radiator petcock right here. Take a 19mm socket. I built myself out of some aluminum foil, a little shield right here so that the coolant, instead of it shooting straight out on the frame, it can follow down and fall into my collection bucket. Take a 19mm socket, put it on the drain plug and unscrew it. It should not be too tight. If it is, try to work it gently. You don't want it to break. And unscrew it until coolant starts coming out. Don't take this out though, because if you do, it'll start shooting backwards. And now we'll just let this drain. In order to speed up the process, let's go remove the radiator cap. There actually is no radiator cap. It's just an overflow cap. This is what holds pressure on the system. So we'll just unthread this. Air will go in as coolant tries to go out. I'm gonna go ahead and close my petcock so that it can stop dripping. Nice and snug, but not too tight. It's just plastic. Let's get this air intake out of here. Lift up on this. Underneath, you'll see the wire. Follow it and unplug the mass airflow sensor. There we go. And I'm trying to remove this whole unit, so I'm just gonna unbolt the clamp on the throttle body and take this out as one whole assembly. There is another connector over here. Unplug that. And to actually get to the throttle body, I need to remove this cover, 3 8mm bolts. Remove these two hoses and then unscrew this clamp with an 8mm socket. Now you can wiggle this whole assembly, pull it right off the throttle body, pick it up and set it aside. Next I want to pull the belt off so I can get the pulley on the alternator freed up. So I'm going to take my 1/2-inch breaker bar, put it into the serpentine belt tensioner here. Then we're going to take tension off the belt. Pull tension off the belt, remove the belt off the alternator, and then release your tool. You don't have to take the belt all the way off, just take it off of the alternator. With a pair of pliers, remove this upper radiator hose clamp. Let's get the rest of this hose off of here. Take the clamp off. Break it free. And remove the hose. Next, let's disconnect the cables for the throttle body. Unhook this spring over here, and then this cable, if you slide it forward and push the cable back, it should pop out. And this one, open up the throttle body all the way and just unhook the cable by sliding it to the side. Just like this. And now I'm just going to unbolt this whole bracket off of the intake. 3 10mm bolts. Take this and just set it to the side. There's a hose back here that needs to come off. At the front here we have a heater core hose. Grab some pliers, take the clamp off, break the hose free, and let's remove it off of the intake. Coolant's coming out, keep that in mind. Okay, I guess it was just a drip. Set this aside. A little hose over here. I'm gonna use a flathead screwdriver for this one. Loosen up the clamp, break the hose free, and remove the hose. Now this one will stay attached. I'm not going to take it off the other end because it's actually hooked onto the throttle body right there. I like to get some of these wires and vacuum hoses out of the way. So I'm going to peel this boot back, and with the battery disconnected, we can use a 10mm socket, unbolt the main power wire to the starter. Try not to lose this mounting nut. Take that off. I'm going to put the nut back on so I can save it for later. And now, it looks like someone secured this with a giant wire tie, so let's cut this off. Okay, let's get that out of there. That held this broken connector in. Need a pocket screwdriver for this one. Pry the locking tab forward towards the front of the alternator and pull up. And now we just have to remove a few 10mm bolts. This one being one of them. And this one right here. This will take this whole bracket out underneath here. And now the alternator is free to come right out. Let's remove the power steering bracket off the intake. 10mm socket. Remove these electrical connectors over here. It leads to the back of the intake there. So I'm going to grab a little screwdriver and very, very gently pry this hose off of here. Okay, follow this, goes over there, over here, this red one. Okay, now we can very carefully move this out of the way. The wires are very fragile, or the hoses, not the wires. We need to disconnect some of these vacuum hoses here. So I'm gonna pull this one off of here, leave the end connected to the throttle body. There's another one that goes back there. Looks like it has a little clamp, so let's grab some needle nose pliers, unhook this clamp, and remove the hose. Oh, okay, the whole PCV valve comes out. That's fine, I guess. Okay, finally, this comes off. So now, this can stay right here. For now, throttle body can be removed with all of these hoses still attached to it. I'm gonna use an 8mm wrench and remove these bolts that hold the throttle body onto the intake. Okay, that can stay there. On this side, I'm going to have to use a swivel. Okay, here it is. Take that out. Now we have to undo the EGR valve. So it looks like this whole assembly is connected with this bracket, and then this is connected to that, which is also connected to this, and it's like a whole concoction of things that need to come apart. So I'm going to start by unplugging the exhaust pressure sensor, or the EGR pressure sensor, and it can stay attached to the bracket. But we have to unbolt this bracket from the intake with a 10mm right here. Now this can come off, and we can disconnect or unplug the two hoses that go to the EGR. And now we can unbolt the EGR from the throttle body. To do that, you can use a deep 10mm socket. There you go. Of course, that one comes right out. This big one can come with the throttle body, but this one back here needs to slide off. There's a connection back there. Let's unhook that. There's your throttle body with all the attachments and hoses and everything. Now I need to unplug and remove all of the ignition coils and then unplug the fuel injectors. So I'm going to just unplug both at the same time. Just start on one side, work my way to the other. The fuel injectors can stay with the intake, but the ignition coils need to be removed. Use a pocket screwdriver for this connection here. Try to pry up the tab and disconnect it. I'm going to leave this over here. Now we can lift up this harness and just move it out of my way a little bit. Let's get a 7mm and unbolt all the ignition coils. And let's do the same to the driver's side. Okay, so now to disconnect these fuel lines, you need these special adapters that you can slide over the line. I'm going to start with this one. Press the adapter in. Okay, pull the line towards the tool. Try to push it back. There we go. I know you couldn't see that, but there it is. All right, let's do the other one. This one is a larger size. Do the same thing. Press the tool in. Once the tool bottoms out, press the line or pull the line towards you. Okay. And just like that, you can, oh, yep, there we go. There's always fuel in the line, so, watch out for that. And take this out. And now in order to remove this intake manifold, I'm gonna take out the 9 bolts that hold it on. They're all 10 millimeter in size. So I'm gonna start from the outside and work my way in. Some of them are different, so remember how they go. This here, for example, holds the thermostat housing in place. Take this line out of here. Lift up the intake, see if there's anything else connected to it. Okay, there it is. Set this aside. Remove the old gaskets. Now to replace the knock sensor, go ahead and unplug it. Then with a 10 millimeter socket, go ahead and break free the bolt that holds on the knock sensor and just remove the bolt completely. Once you've done that, save the bolt because we'll have to reuse it, and pull the knock sensor right up and out. Make sure this surface is clean. You want the knock sensor to have a good, flat, clean mounting surface. That way it can take a proper reading. I'm going to use this razor blade and just gently scrape off the debris on the side here. And it's important that you torque this bolt as well. You don't want to just wing it, because if it's too tight, it can be too sensitive in taking its reading, and if it's not tight enough, it won't be sensitive enough, and you want this to read properly. So get the bolt through the knock sensor and thread it down. Make sure it goes in nice and smooth. Okay, make sure it's aimed correctly. You don't want the wire to be caught up here or pinched over there or whatever. 18 foot-pounds is the torque for this bolt. Right there. Now take your new knock sensor and plug it in. Make sure it clicks, and just make sure you secure the wiring harness so it's not hitting anything. It's time to reinstall the intake. When you do this, make sure you put new gaskets on. I did. So this is ready to go. The surface is clean. Let's bring the intake in and slide it down onto the head here. Make sure you don't pinch any wires. I'm going to go back there and double check. Make sure your fuel lines are accessible and not jammed between the firewall and the intake. All right, let's make sure everything's lined up. It is. Let's put the bolts in. Don't forget to put this on, and then drop the bolts through. Make sure that these line up. I'm going to start all of them by hand before I go any further. That way I make sure that the threads are good. So now let's put the rest of them back. Now I'm going to bottom out all the bolts starting from the center, working my way out. And the torque spec for this has 2 passes in that sequence, one at 18 inch-pounds and the other one at 18 foot-pounds. 18 inch-pounds is basically just bottomed out. So if I just bottom it out, there's the first pass. Okay, now let's torque them all. 18 foot-pounds. Intake is torqued down. Let's get the throttle body on. Bring in the throttle body and we'll install this. Okay, make sure the gasket's still seated in place there. And then try to line up the bolts. I think this one, yep, that one lines up. I'm gonna start this one in and finally one at the back. Pretty difficult to see all these, but just feel for them. I'm gonna go ahead and bottom these out and then we'll snug them up. All right, so with the throttle body on, I have a slight situation here with the vacuum hoses because I actually bought a new PCV hose system assembly here. So it also came with this hose, which is the coolant hose that leads to this valve on the throttle body. And then from there, it leads through this to the intake. Well, this is staying, but this rear hose has to go, as well as, I think, this one over here, which is to be replaced with this, which is on the new assembly. So basically, you may not have to do this step, but I do. So I'm just gonna quickly swap over some hoses. And once it's rerouted, because you probably don't have to do this, I'm not gonna show you in detail, but I will show you exactly how it needs to be routed once it's all done. So here's what it's supposed to look like once it's done. Right out of the PCV from the valve cover, make sure that's pressed in all the way. So from down here, this main long tube, plastic tube, goes all the way to the back of the intake. It's got a large rubber 90-degree fitting on there. Make sure that's plugged in. It tees off of this into a smaller little tube, plastic tube that feeds the throttle body. This is your PCV. This assembly is a heated PCV with coolant, so it has 2 coolant hoses that go into here. You can see one comes off of the water pump tube off the back, comes into the PCV on the valve cover, goes back out into the throttle body over here, right where the vacuum hose goes in. Then it comes out through this hose, which will plug into the intake. And one of the only other hoses here is a coolant hose, this main heater core hose that also plugs into the intake. So let's get those in, but this is kind of what this is all supposed to look like. It's a mess, not easy to figure out, especially if you were in my situation where someone kind of rigged everything and hacked it together and I had to figure out what piece goes where, but this is what it's supposed to look like. So let's get this main heater core hose plugged in, get the clamp back on, and then get the smaller hose from the throttle body back on as well. This one just had a hose clamp. Go ahead and tighten that back up. Make sure it's pressed down all the way. Nice and snug. Now it's time to reconnect the fuel lines, and to do that, it's much easier than removing them. All you have to do is line them up and press them on until they click and snap into place. It's kind of hard to show you when I'm actually doing it because there's very limited space, but this is what it should look like when you're done. You're supposed to see the spring around it seat right into place, and if you don't see it, that means it has not snapped around the retaining ring on the fuel rail. and it will pop off eventually. So make sure that you can see that spring looking retainer around it. Double check it, even triple check it if you have to. And obviously we'll check for fuel leaks when we're done. But for now, just make sure that the feed and the return lines are pressed onto the fuel rail tightly. Let's reconnect all of our fuel injectors, and then we'll drop the ignition coils in, bolt those up, and plug those in as well. When you plug in the fuel injectors, make sure it has a good connection. I'm gonna blow out the holes that the spark plugs sit in. That way when I drop the ignition coils in, there's no debris that gets stuck in there, just in case any fell. I prefer to put all my ignition coils back in the same order that they came out in. It's not necessary, it's just what I prefer to do. And another tip is to put some silicone paste or dielectric grease on the end of the ignition coils. This will just help them to not only seal up better moisture-wise, but also to prevent them from getting stuck on the spark plugs when the next time comes that you have to pull them out. I'm just going to drop all of them in and then I'll bolt them up. While I'm here, I'm going to go ahead and plug them all in. These just have some screws that hold them on, so start them into the intake and just go ahead and snug them up. That's snug. Just do the same thing down the line, and of course we'll do the same thing to the other side once this side's done. So I did the same on this side. I plugged in all of the injectors, ignition coils, bolted them on. Everything is all set. Let's situate all these vacuum hoses wherever they have to go. So this hose goes onto the intake tube. We'll leave this aside for now. Same with this one over here. These two connectors will go on a little valve that goes here in a minute. We're going to ignore that. This goes on the top of the throttle body over there. There are two hoses at the back of the throttle body. One goes to this evap solenoid here, which connects onto the top of the two rear fittings. And then your brake booster line will connect onto the bottom of the two rear fittings. Press that on all the way, make sure that it's secure, otherwise you lose power brakes if that pops off. Then you have this line right over here, which is supposed to connect to your, it's a red vacuum hose. It connects to your fuel pressure regulator down here. And you also have this tan off-white vacuum hose, which connects to this evap control unit here, which is also where this line comes from, the vacuum hose that connects to the top of the rear of the throttle body. And while we're here, let's plug in the throttle body, or the throttle position sensor, that is. That goes over here, just like that. I'm going to remove these two bolts that I left here on the throttle body just so I don't lose them. And I'm going to go ahead and bolt the EGR back up. Now, of course, you should use a gasket here, preferably a new gasket. If you don't have one, you can try and see if you can save and reuse your old one, but most likely it's not going to work. So put on a new gasket, slide this on, and bolt it up. Let's tighten this up. Make sure it's nice and snug so it can seal up. You don't want any leaks here. And at the top here, you see this vacuum hose, the green one, that actually plugs in to the EGR valve. Just like that. And over here went this triangulated bracket, which bolts onto the power steering pump reservoir bracket. And then on the other side, it bolts up to the upper radiator hose neck. Now let's put in this bracket, which has the EGR pressure sensor on it, and then this solenoid here. This went right in here behind all these vacuum hoses. This hook, this loop here, went over this first bolt on the EGR valve. So you'll have to slide that over. And then it has a nut that clamps it on. Okay, just like that. Make sure you're not pinching any vacuum lines here, but also don't pull on them too hard because they do break. Plug this in so this connector stops flopping around. I'm going to plug these two hoses in so that this can be situated. So let's let's put on the nut that holds it on back there. While I'm here, I'm just going to go ahead and plug in these two hoses. One is smaller, one is larger, as you can see. Go ahead and plug them in their corresponding fitting. Okay, so this nut is on. There's a screw here that secures this bracket to the intake. I'm going to start by tightening this one. And now let's tighten up this one in the back here. Okay, that's secured. Let's plug this in here. Plug in the sensor. Now let's reconnect this bracket for the throttle cables. Had 3 screws that mounted it to the intake. And reconnect the throttle cables. Attach the spring. Attach this cable. And of course, we will attach this one as well. All right, test it. Yep, perfect. No slack. Make sure the throttle body closes all the way. If it doesn't, most likely your cable is not adjusted properly, but if it was before you took the bracket off, it's probably because the bracket isn't sitting far enough in. So just make sure that that is happening. It looks like I do have a little bit of movement. So what I'm going to do is loosen up the nuts on the bracket just a little bit so I can adjust it. If you don't do this right, you'll have a high idle and well, it's just not going to be fun. Of course, you could adjust the cable, but you know, it was already adjusted, so might as well adjust it from the bracket. Okay, that's better actually. So we'll tighten this up. All right, now I want to put the alternator back. Had a couple bolts up here. One that just fell in the valley here, but here it is. And then 2 main bolts on the bottom. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to tighten up these bottom bolts first. That will make sure that the alternator is positioned properly, and then I'll tighten up the 2 top bracket bolts. Make sure they're nice and snug. Now bring the wiring harness over and let's plug it in. The one thing you want to check though is this main power wire. If it has any corrosion on it, go ahead and sand it with some fine sandpaper or a wire brush or whatever you have just to get the corrosion off of there. Mine's actually perfect, so I'm just going to go ahead and install it. I'm going to route it behind these coolant hoses because I'm pretty sure that's how it was before. I'm going to tighten this one by hand because I don't want to accidentally over tighten it. If you over tighten this, you can break the stud inside the alternator and that would not be good. So just give it a nice quick snug and then plug in the other 2 wires, which I should have routed behind prior, but here we go. This is one. Make sure that clicks in. And then the other one goes in right here. Make sure this one clicks in as well. Let's put the upper radiator hose in. Make sure it's fully seated on this fitting. Get the clamp and put it right back where it belongs. If your clamp is weak, consider replacing it with either another one of these or a warm clamp, whatever works for you. Make sure it's seated on all the other pulleys, which it looks like it is, so that is perfect. Take tension off the tensioner, slip the belt on, let go of your tool, double check the pulleys again. They all look perfect. Remember, if it's off, it will literally just shred itself as soon as you start it, so make sure that it's good. Take the breaker bar out of here. Let's bolt up the top bolt. And lastly, the air filter housing with the rest of the intake here. Slide that over the throttle body, just like this. You got 2 hoses that went in here. Let's tighten up this clamp. Make sure this is pushed on all the way when you tighten the clamp. Nice and snug. These hoses are in. There's a wire here. Reconnect the sensor here. And on this side you have the mass airflow sensor. Reconnect that. Make sure it clicks. Secure the harness and secure the air filter housing. Now to reinstall the battery, make sure it's positioned all the way down on the battery post. It's important so it can make a good connection. And then use your 8mm wrench or socket, whatever you prefer, and tighten it back up. Now it's time to fill up the cooling system. What I have set up here is a spill-proof funnel, which also helps bleed the system. Because this is now the highest point in the cooling system, naturally the air will want to rise up into my funnel and not get trapped in the system. The only downside with doing this on this type of system is this overflow tank is also the filler, and it's not supposed to be full. If you fill this all the way up, you are way over full, and it's going to start spilling out once it warms up. So once you do fill this all the way up, if you choose to raise it up into the funnel, you want to make sure you drain some afterwards, either with a turkey baster or fluid extraction syringe, whatever you have, or just drain it out the radiator just a little bit. But there's a mark, which I'll show you in a second, and you don't want to be above that mark, otherwise you're overfull. So what I'm going to do here is just put in a little bit. Looks like this wasn't tight all the way. Make sure this is tight if you use this type of funnel, otherwise it'll leak out here as you do this. So now let's go ahead and put in the appropriate amount of coolant. It'll take about 2 gallons, maybe 2.5, depending on how much you drained. And if you don't know what kind of coolant to use, refer to your owner's manual and make sure you use the appropriate type. If you look closely, you can see right there, it says cold fill on the reservoir. That's exactly where you want to fill it up to. If you put a flashlight in either in the tank or to the side of it, you'll see the coolant line, the level, and just make sure you don't go past it unless you are actively trying to bleed it in your funnel here. So I actually filled mine right up to that fill mark. So now let me run you through the bleeding procedure. First, you want to wait for it to naturally stop bubbling. If it's still bubbling, just give it a minute. Wait for it to stop getting air out of the system. All right, now with the key in the ignition, let's fire it up. Starts right up. That's perfect. Now, once it's turned on, let's turn on some heat here. So turn on the blower. Make sure the AC is off. Turn the heat all the way up. I have this digital display. If you have the analog one with the knobs, just turn it all the way up. You want the coolant circulating through that heater core, and I'm gonna set it to vent. That way I can feel when the air blows warm over here. So I'm just gonna give it a minute and then wait for the air to blow over here. While it's warming up, pay attention to this temperature gauge and make sure it doesn't go above the halfway mark. Right now it's still cold, I just turned it on, but once it reaches full operating temperature, shut it off and obviously make sure you have heat through the vents. With everything back together, go ahead and run the vehicle and make sure everything is good, and then take it for a road test.
When only the best will do, demand TRQ. The only company that lets you view before you do. TRQ is committed to offering the highest quality aftermarket auto parts that are engineered for peace of mind. Thanks for using and viewing with TRQ.